There's a special kind of silence that comes when your children stop calling. It settles in your chest like winter frost, quiet and cold, until you wonder if love was ever enough. Jovan Pike knew that silence well. At 81, he arrived at an old stone mansion from his childhood, now crumbling and forgotten beneath the snow. His children had moved on with their lives. He carried only a red suitcase and decided this broken place would be his last home. Day by day, he began fixing it, patching windows, cleaning rooms, finding old letters left behind by strangers. The town heard about the old man working alone. Then, one morning, footsteps appeared in the frost beside his. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The highway stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of black cutting through fields of white. Jovan Pike kept both hands on the steering wheel of his old Buick, though the road was nearly empty. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in a steady rhythm, clearing away the light snow that had begun falling an hour ago. In the passenger seat sat his red leather suitcase, the same one he'd carried on his honeymoon 47 years earlier. Everything else he owned had been sold, donated, or left behind in the modest ranch house where he'd raised his children alone. His hand moved unconsciously to his coat pocket, fingers finding the familiar weight of his grandfather's brass pocket watch. He pulled it out, thumbed open the cover. The hands were frozen at 3:47, had been for years. He'd been meaning to get it fixed, but somehow the stillness of it felt appropriate now. Time had stopped for him in certain ways, or at least that's how it seemed when the phone calls from his children grew shorter, then less frequent, then stopped altogether. Margaret was 43 now, a corporate lawyer in Boston with a corner office and a view of the harbor. She'd always been the serious one, even as a girl reading thick books while other children played outside, organizing her dolls by height and hair color. After her mother died, Margaret had become even more determined, as if success could fill the hollow space left behind. Jovan was proud of her, fiercely so, but somewhere along the way, she'd learned to keep the world at arm's length, including him. Their last conversation 6 months ago had been brief. She was preparing for a major case. She'd call back later. She never did. Daniel, his middle child, had moved to Seattle 12 years ago to work for a tech company whose name Jovan could never quite remember. Something to do with cloud storage, though Jovan still wasn't entirely sure what that meant. Daniel had married young, divorced quietly, and threw himself into work the way some men throw themselves into drink. He sent a Christmas card every year with a generic printed message and no personal note. Last year's card had arrived in February, forwarded from his old address. Jovan had studied the photo of Daniel standing alone in front of the Space Needle, trying to read something in his son's forced smile. Sarah, his youngest at 37, taught American literature at a university in Chicago. She'd inherited her mother's gentle nature and love of poetry. Of the 3 children, she'd stayed closest the longest, calling every Sunday evening for years after Anna died. But even Sarah had drifted away. Her husband traveled constantly for work. She was busy with academic committees and research papers. The calls became every other week, then monthly, then stopped. The last time Jovan had heard her voice was on his 80th birthday, when she'd left a voicemail apologizing for missing his call, promising to try again soon. He hadn't told any of them he was leaving. What would he have said? That he'd sold the house where they'd grown up because every room echoed with absence? That he couldn't bear another holiday alone, heating up a single serving of turkey and watching old movies he'd seen a dozen times? That he was tired of being the one who always called first, always reached out, always pretended not to notice the distance growing between them? The truth was simpler and more complicated than all of that. Jovan Pike had spent 30 years as a high school history teacher, helping other people's children understand the past, and somehow he'd lost track of his own story. After Anna died breast cancer, quick and cruel, taking her in 9 months, he'd focused everything on raising Margaret, Daniel, and Sarah. He'd been both mother and father, cook and comforter, homework helper and heart mender. He'd done his best, but his best had always felt like it wasn't quite enough. Maybe he'd held them too tight. Maybe he'd let them go too easily. Maybe there was no right way to be a single father to 3 grieving children while drowning in his own grief. He'd done what he could, and they'd grown up and moved away, which is what children are supposed to do. Except he'd thought moving away didn't have to mean disappearing completely. The GPS on his phone announced the turn was approaching in 2 miles. Jovan slowed, though there was no other traffic. The landscape had grown increasingly rural over the past hour, farmhouses set far back from the road, bare trees stark against grey sky, the occasional silo rising like a lighthouse in a sea of snow. This was the country of his childhood, though he hadn't been back in more than 50 years. His grandparents had owned the estate, a stone mansion built in the 1922 by some wealthy industrialist whose fortune evaporated in the Depression. They'd bought it for almost nothing in 1948, a summer retreat from the heat and noise of the city. Jovan had spent 3 summers there as a boy, running through gardens that seemed to stretch forever, exploring rooms filled with furniture covered in white sheets, swimming in the pond at the edge of the property. His grandfather had died first. Suddenly, a heart attack, while reading the newspaper in the library. His grandmother had followed 2 years later, and the house had passed to Jovan's father, who'd never much cared for the place. It had sat empty, visited occasionally by caretakers, slowly declining. When his father died 15 years ago, the estate had become Jovan's. He'd never visited, had barely thought about it except when the property tax bills arrived each year. He'd considered selling it 100 times, but never got around to it. Now he understood why. Some part of him had been saving it, though he hadn't known for what until 3 weeks ago, when he'd stood in his empty living room, the last box packed, and realized he didn't want to move to some sterile apartment complex where old people went to wait out their remaining years. He wanted to go somewhere that meant something. Somewhere he could work with his hands and his back, and not think so much about the phone that never rang. Somewhere he could rebuild something instead of watching everything slowly fall apart. The turn came up on his right, a narrow road, barely ploughed, leading between 2 stone pillars. The iron gates that had once hung there were long gone. Jovan eased the Buick onto the drive, feeling the tires crunch over packed snow and ice. The road wound through bare woods for half a mile before opening into a clearing, and there it was. The mansion rose 3 stories, its grey stone facade darker than he remembered, stained by decades of weather and neglect. Snow clung to the pitched roof and filled the empty window frames where glass had long since shattered. The grand front steps, which had once been swept clean every morning by his grandmother, were buried under drifts. The fountain in the circular drive held only ice and dead leaves. Vines climbed the walls, brown and brittle in the winter cold, forcing their way between stones. It was worse than he'd imagined. And somehow it was perfect. Jovan parked the Buick at the bottom of the steps and sat for a long moment, engine running, heat blasting. The rational part of his mind catalogued everything that was wrong, the roof damage visible even from here, the structural concerns, the sheer impossibility of one 81-year-old man restoring a 12-room mansion in the middle of nowhere during winter. But rationality had gotten him a quiet life, a respected career, and a house full of memories he could no longer live with. Rationality had not taught him how to make his children love him enough to stay. He turned off the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the distant cry of a crow. He retrieved his red suitcase from the passenger seat and opened the car door, stepping out into ankle-deep snow. The cold hit him immediately, sharper than he'd expected. He pulled his coat tighter and trudged up the steps, each one requiring effort, his breath coming out in white clouds. The front door, a massive thing of oak and iron, hung partially open. The lock had rusted through years ago. Jovan pushed the door wide and stepped inside. The entry hall stretched before him, 2 stories high, with a staircase curving up to the second floor. Snow had blown in through broken windows, creating small drifts in the corners. The chandelier that had once hung from the ceiling lay in pieces on the marble floor, paint peeled from the walls in long strips. The smell of mold and decay was overwhelming. He set his suitcase down and walked slowly through the ground floor. The parlor where his grandmother had served tea. The dining room where his grandfather had carved Sunday roasts. The library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, most of the books ruined by water damage. The kitchen with its ancient stove and cracked tile floor. The conservatory at the back of the house, its glass walls completely shattered, filled with the skeletons of plants that had frozen decades ago. Everything was broken, everything could be fixed. As darkness fell, Joven made camp in the kitchen. He found the water shut-off valve and was surprised when the pipes didn't burst as he turned it back on. He had a camp stove in the car, canned soup, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather. He'd thought this through more carefully than he'd thought through most things in recent years. That night, lying in his sleeping bag on the kitchen floor, still wearing his coat, he watched snow fall through a crack in the ceiling above. The house settled around him with groans and creaks, the sounds of old bones adjusting to occupation after years of emptiness. Joven reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the brass watch. 3:47. Frozen time. He thought about his children sleeping in their distant cities, dreaming dreams he would never know. He thought about his late wife, Anna, who had believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. He thought about his grandparents and the life they'd built in this house before time caught up with them too. Then he thought about morning, and the work that would begin, and the small satisfaction of repairing one broken thing at a time. Tomorrow he would start with a single room, then another, then another. He had no deadline, no one waiting for him, no reason to hurry. For the first time in longer than he could remember, that felt less like loneliness and more like freedom. The watch sat heavy in his palm. Time had stopped at 3:47, but Joven Pike was going to start it moving again. He closed his eyes and slept. Morning came with pale sunlight filtering through broken windows, painting patterns across the dusty floor. Joven woke stiff and cold, every joint protesting as he pushed himself upright. His breath misted in the frigid air. The sleeping bag had kept him alive but not comfortable. He was 81 years old, and his body made sure he remembered it each morning. He heated water on the camp stove for instant coffee, drank it black while standing at the kitchen window. Outside, the ground stretched away in white silence. He could see the edge of the pond in the distance, frozen solid. Beyond that, woods. Beyond that, nothing but miles of countryside and the small town his grandmother used to drive to for groceries. What was it called? Millbrook. Population maybe 1,000, if that. After coffee came the work of exploring. Not the quick tour of last night, but a real assessment of what he'd gotten himself into. Joven started with the first floor, moving room by room, mentally cataloguing every crack, every stain, every broken thing. He found mouse nests in the corners and evidence of raccoons in the dining room. The hardwood floors were warped in places where rain had come through the ceiling. Some of the wallpaper hung in strips, revealing horsehair plaster underneath. But the bones of the house were solid. The foundation appeared sound. The stone. Walls had withstood decades of neglect. This was a place built to last, back when people constructed houses as if their great-grandchildren would live in them. By noon, he'd worked his way to the study, a wood-paneled room on the east side of the house. Heavy curtains, rotted through, still hung at the windows. A massive desk dominated the space mahogany, carved with intricate details along the legs. His grandfather had bought the desk with the house, part of the original furnishings. Joven tried the drawers. Most opened easily enough, revealing old pens, paper clips turned to rust, yellowed stationery. The bottom right drawer stuck. He pulled harder, feeling something give, and it slid open with a screech of wood on wood. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of letters. He lifted them carefully. The oilcloth had protected them from the worst of the moisture. The envelopes were addressed in elegant script to Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore at this address. The return addresses were various, some from New York, some from addresses overseas. Military postal codes. Jovan carried the bundle to the window where the light was better. He unwrapped the oilcloth and selected the first letter, postmarked July 1943. The paper was brittle but legible. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "France is not what we expected. I cannot tell you where exactly, but know that I am well and thinking of you always. The men speak of home with such longing. I tell them about our house, about the gardens you tend, about James learning to ride his bicycle in the drive. These memories are what keep us going." The letter was signed, "All my love, Samuel." Jovan read another, then another. The story emerged slowly, pieced together from these fragments of the past. Samuel and Eleanor Whitmore had lived in this house. They had 2 sons, James and Robert. When the war came, both boys had enlisted. Samuel had written to Eleanor regularly, letters full of love and worry and hope that the war would end soon so they could all be together again. One letter, dated November 1944, was different in tone. "My darling, I received word today that I cannot bring myself to write. James was killed in Belgium 3 weeks ago. I only learned of it now. I do not know how to tell Robert when I see him next. I do not know how to come home and face the emptiness. Our beautiful boy, gone. I know you are reading this, and your heart is breaking as mine is broken. We will bear this together, somehow. We must." Jovan set the letter down, his hands trembling. He sat in the desk chair, heedless of the dust, and pressed his palms against his eyes. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to stumble into someone else's grief while drowning in his own. He read the remaining letters. Robert had survived the war and come home. Samuel had eventually returned too. But the letters from Eleanor to Samuel, he found a few drafts she'd never sent, revealed a woman trying to hold her family together while mourning, a son she'd never see again. One draft, written in pencil on the back of a grocery list, simply read, "How do we live in this house, knowing he will never walk through the door again? How do I set the table for 3 when it should be 4? Jovan understood that question better than he wanted to. He found a final letter, dated 1953, from Robert to his mother. "Dear Mom, I know you and Dad have decided to leave the house. I understand why you can't stay there anymore. Too many memories of James in every room. I wish things were different. I wish I could visit more, but my work keeps me in California and Mary's family is here. Please know that I love you both, even if the miles between us make it hard to show." So they'd left. Eleanor and Samuel had abandoned this house because their grief was too heavy to carry within its walls. And Robert, the surviving son, had stayed away because returning meant confronting what had been lost. Jovan sat in the silent study as afternoon light faded. He thought about James Whitmore, killed at 19 in a war fought an ocean away. He thought about Eleanor, tending gardens for a son who'd never come home. He thought about Samuel, writing letters from the front while his world collapsed. He thought about Robert, caught between duty to his parents and the need to build his own life somewhere else. Different circumstances, same outcome, families scattered, houses abandoned, love not enough to overcome the weight of loss and distance. But there was something else in these letters too, a desperate, defiant hope. Eleanor writing about spring bulbs she'd planted, determined to see them bloom. Samuel describing stars over France and promising to show them to James someday, even after James was gone, as if hope itself could resurrect the dead. Robert promising to visit, even though he never did, because the promise mattered. Jovan carefully rewrapped the letters in the oilcloth and placed them back in the drawer. He stood, joints, protesting, and walked to the window. Snow had started falling again, light flurries that wouldn't amount to much. The grounds were empty. No children would ever play there again. No one would gather for summer parties or Christmas dinners, unless he made it so. The realization struck him with unexpected force. He'd come here thinking he was running away, finding a place to hide from his own failures as a father. But Eleanor and Samuel had run too, and their running had solved nothing. The house had simply sat empty, holding its grief like a tomb. What if instead of running, he stayed? What if instead of hiding, he rebuilt? Not just the walls and windows and floors, but something bigger. A place that said, despite everything, despite loss and distance, and all the ways families break apart, there could still be home. There could still be welcome. He didn't know if his children would ever come. Didn't know if Margaret would ever soften, or Daniel would ever open up, or Sarah would ever find time in her busy life. But he could make a place for them anyway. He could repair this house the way he'd failed to repair the damage in his own family. And if they never came, well, at least he'd have tried. At least he'd have built something beautiful from ruins. The decision settled into his bones like warmth after cold. He would restore Whitmore House, every room, every window, every broken thing he could reach, not as a monument to his own loneliness, but as an act of faith that broken things could be made whole again. He would need supplies, tools, materials. That meant a trip to town, which he'd been avoiding, but there was no avoiding it now. Jovan took the brass watch from his pocket and looked at it once more. 3:47, frozen time. He thought about Eleanor's letters, about James who'd never come home, about Samuel and Robert and all the words left unsaid between them. Then he put the watch away and went to find his coat. Tomorrow he would begin the real work. Tonight he'd drive to Millbrook and face whatever came next. The first step in rebuilding anything was admitting you needed help, even if asking for it felt like the hardest thing in the world. The drive to Millbrook took 20 minutes on roads that hadn't seen a plough in days. Jovan kept the Buick steady, mindful of ice beneath the snow. The town appeared gradually, first a scattering of houses, then a main street with shops huddled together as if for warmth against the winter wind. He parked in front of the hardware store, a narrow building with faded red paint and a bell that jangled when he pushed through the door. Inside smelled of machine oil and sawdust. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Shelves stretched to the ceiling, packed with tools and supplies in no particular order that Jovan could discern. "Help you?" A woman's voice came from behind the counter. She was perhaps 70, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a flannel shirt and an expression that suggested she'd seen everything twice and hadn't been impressed the first time. "I need cleaning supplies," Jovan said. "Mops, buckets, industrial cleaner, work gloves. Basic tools, hammer, screwdrivers, that sort of thing." The woman studied him with sharp, dark eyes. "You're the one bought the Whitmore place." It wasn't a question. Small towns, Jovan remembered, had their own intelligence networks that would put the CIA to shame. "I'm Jovan Pike. I inherited it, actually. From my father. He inherited it from his parents. Martha Chen." She didn't offer her hand, just nodded toward the back of the store. "Cleaning supplies are aisle 3. Tools are along the wall. You planning to fix that place up yourself?" "That's the idea." Martha made a sound that might have been amusement or skepticism. "You know it's got 12 rooms and the roof's half gone." "I've seen the roof." "You know you're 80 if you're a day?" 81. "And you think you can restore a mansion by yourself in the middle of winter?" Jovan met her gaze. "I think I can try." Something shifted in Martha's expression. Not approval exactly, but a fraction less skepticism. "Your funeral? Let me show you what you'll need." For the next hour, Martha walked him through the store, pulling items from shelves with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for 50 years. She explained which cleaners worked on stone, which wouldn't damage old wood, which brushes were worth buying and which were junk. She asked practical questions about the house. Was the foundation sound? Had he checked for asbestos? What was his budget? And nodded at his answers without judgment. At the register, she tallied everything up. The total made Jovan wince, but he'd expected as much. His teacher's pension wasn't generous, but he'd saved carefully, and the house sale had left him with a modest cushion. Enough to buy supplies. Enough to survive a year or two if he was careful. "You'll be back," Martha said, loading supplies into boxes. "This won't be enough. Not even close. I know. Whitmore Place has been empty 20 years. I remember when old Samuel died, 67, I think. Eleanor followed soon after. Their son never came back, not even for the funerals. House just sat there, rotting. Jovan carried a box to the car, came back for another. You knew them? Knew of them. My husband used to do odd jobs for Eleanor before she left, said she was sad all the time, couldn't get over losing her boy in the war." Martha handed him the last box. "You got family coming to help?" The question landed harder than she probably intended. "No, it's just me." Martha nodded slowly, her expression softening slightly. "Well, like I said, you'll be back. And I make soup on Thursdays. Always make too much. You're welcome to stop by." It was the closest thing to kindness Jovan had heard in months. His throat tightened unexpectedly. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't tasted my soup." Driving back. Boxes. Rattling in the trunk, Jovan felt something he hadn't felt since arriving, not quite hope, but its distant cousin. Someone knew he existed. Someone had offered soup. Small things maybe, but when you'd been invisible for long enough, small things felt enormous. That afternoon, he began work on the kitchen. It seemed the logical place to start. A man needed somewhere to cook, somewhere warm to sit. He'd camp there until he got other rooms habitable. The work was harder than he'd anticipated. 70 years of grime didn't surrender easily. He scrubbed counters until his arms ached, swept floors until dust coated his clothes and hair, wiped down cabinets that revealed surprisingly good wood underneath the dirt. The ancient stove, a massive cast-iron thing, took 2 hours of scrubbing before it looked functional. He didn't dare try lighting it yet. That would require checking the gas lines, a job for someone who knew what they were doing. As he worked, wedged into the corner beneath the sink, his hand struck something that rattled. He pulled out a small wooden object, brushed off the dust. A toy train, hand-carved, surprisingly detailed. Initials were scratched into the bottom. J. W. James Whitmore, Eleanor's son, the boy who died in Belgium. Jovan sat back on his heels, holding the train carefully. It was old, probably carved in the 30s or 40s. He imagined a young James playing with it on this kitchen floor while Eleanor cooked dinner, Samuel reading the newspaper at the table. A family, whole and happy, before the war came and took it all apart. He thought about his own children. Margaret with her toy microscope, studying leaves and insects with fierce concentration. Daniel building elaborate structures from blocks, explaining their engineering with absolute seriousness. Sarah, his youngest, lining up her stuffed animals and reading to them from picture books, giving each one a different voice. When had they stopped playing? When had they grown up and grown away? He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. It had happened gradually, the way everything important happens too slowly to notice until it's already gone. Jovan placed the toy train on the windowsill, where light from the setting sun caught the worn wood. A small memorial, a reminder that this house had held life before, could hold life again. By evening, the kitchen was transformed. Not beautiful, not yet, but clean, functional. The floor mopped, the windows scrubbed, one section of counter cleared and ready for his camp stove. He heated canned stew and ate standing up, too tired to bother with formality. His phone sat on the counter beside him. Silent, as always. He'd charged it from the car battery earlier, checked for messages. Nothing. He scrolled through his contacts, found Sarah's number, thumb hovering over the call button. What would he say? "Hi, honey. I'm living in a condemned mansion, scrubbing floors until my hands bleed, trying to fix something I don't know how to fix." He set the phone down without calling. That night, in his sleeping bag on the kitchen floor, cleaner now but still cold, Jovan composed letters in his mind. Letters to Margaret, Daniel, Sarah. Letters explaining why he'd left, where he'd gone, what he was trying to do. But the words never came out right. They sounded defensive or pitiful or desperate, and he didn't want to be any of those things. Maybe he wouldn't write letters. Maybe he'd just keep working, day by day, room by room, fixing what he could fix. And if that wasn't enough to bring them back, at least he'd have something to show for his time. At least he'd have tried to build something instead of watching everything crumble. The toy train on the windowsill caught moonlight, casting shadows across the floor. Somewhere in the house, the wind found a crack and moaned through it like memory itself. Jovan closed his eyes and slept the sleep of the exhausted, dreaming of children who never quite came home. 2 weeks became a rhythm. Wake with the sun, heat water for coffee, work until exhaustion demanded rest. The kitchen was finished, truly finished, stove-tested and working, windows patched with plastic until he could afford proper glass, even a small table and chair he'd found in the servant quarters and restored. From there, he'd moved to the entry hall, clearing debris, patching holes in the plaster, sweeping until the marble floor emerged from beneath decades of dirt. His body adjusted to the work in ways that surprised him. The first week had been agony, every muscle screaming, joints swollen, hands blistered despite the work gloves. But gradually something shifted. The aches became familiar instead of alarming. His grip strengthened. He moved through the house with more confidence, learning which floorboards were solid and which would give way if he stepped wrong. On Thursday of the second week, he drove to Millbrook and found Martha's hardware store closed with a note directing customers to the house around back. He followed a snow-packed path to a small cottage where Martha answered the door holding a ladle. "You came," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "You invited me. People don't always do what they're invited to do." The cottage was warm, filled with the smell of vegetables and chicken broth. Jovan sat at her kitchen table while Martha ladled soup into bowls, set out bread she'd baked that morning, poured tea without asking if he wanted any. They ate in comfortable silence for a while. The soup was good, simple and hearty, the kind of food that tasted like someone cared whether you ate or not. "How's the house coming?" Martha asked finally. Slowly. "The entry hall's clean now. I'm going to start on one of the upstairs bedrooms next, get a proper place to sleep." "Makes sense." She tore a piece of bread, dipped it in her soup. "My husband died 5 years ago. Heart attack. Just dropped in the store one afternoon, gone before the ambulance arrived." Jovan set down his spoon. "I'm sorry. We had 43 years, more than some people get." She looked at him with those sharp eyes. "Your wife? Cancer, 19 years ago. Children? 3. All grown, all far away." Martha nodded, asked nothing more. Some things didn't need elaboration. The silence between them held understanding instead of judgment. After soup came pie apple, with a crust that flaked at the touch of a fork. Jovan ate slowly, savoring each bite. When had he last eaten something made with care instead of heated from a can? "There's a handyman in town," Martha said. "Pete Harrigan. Does good work, reasonable rates. You might want his number." "I'm trying to do this myself. Pride's expensive. So is falling off a ladder when there's no one around to call for help." Jovan smiled, despite himself. "You make a compelling argument. I'm old. I've earned the right to be blunt." She wrote a number on a scrap of paper, pushed it across the table. "At least call him about the roof. That's not work for one man, especially not one your age." He pocketed the number, knowing she was right, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. "Thank you for the company. Come back next Thursday. I always make too much. Driving home, darkness settling over the countryside, Jovan felt the weight of the day differently. Not lighter exactly, but distributed. Someone knew where he was. Someone expected him next week. These small connections, fragile as spider silk, might not seem like much, but to a man who'd been alone too long, they felt like lifelines. The next morning brought disaster. Jovan woke to the sound of something crashing upstairs. He scrambled from his sleeping bag, still groggy, and ran toward the noise. In the east wing, part of the ceiling had collapsed. Snow and debris covered the floor of what had been a bedroom. The damage extended through to the roof. He could see grey sky through a jagged hole. He stood in the doorway, assessing. The collapse wasn't structural, just old plaster finally giving way under the weight of accumulated snow. But it meant the roof was worse than he'd thought. Meant water would pour in with the next storm. Meant damage spreading to other rooms if he didn't act fast. Jovan went back downstairs, found his phone, stared at the scrap of paper Martha had given him. Pride's expensive. He dialed. Harrigan. The voice was rough, weathered. My name is Jovan Pike. Martha Chen gave me your number. I've got a roof situation that needs attention. The Whitmore place. Of course he knew. That's right. I'll come take a look this afternoon. No promises, but I'll look. Pete Harrigan arrived at 2 o'clock in a pickup truck that had seen better decades. He was somewhere in his 60s, built like a man who'd spent his life working with his hands, broad shoulders, scarred knuckles, a face creased by sun and time. He moved through the house with the efficiency of someone assessing structural damage. Barely, speaking except to ask practical questions. In the east wing, he studied the collapsed ceiling, looked up through the hole to the roof above, then turned to Jovan. You're lucky it wasn't worse. Another week of snow and you might have lost the whole wing. Can you fix it? Can fix anything with enough time and money. Question is whether you want to invest either in this place. I'm already invested. Pete nodded slowly. All right then. I can patch the roof. Get it weatherproof. Won't be pretty, but it'll hold. The ceiling needs proper repair, new plaster, the whole deal. That's skilled work. How much? Pete named a figure that made Jovan's stomach drop, then added, I can do it in installments. Work a few days. You pay for materials and my time. We see how it goes. Why would you do that? Because Martha called me yesterday and said you were too stubborn to ask for help. Because that house deserves better than falling to pieces, and because, he paused, something shifting in his expression, because I know what it's like to work on something alone when you shouldn't have to. They shook hands on it. Pete would start tomorrow, work 3 days a week until the roof was secure. Jovan would help where he could, pay what he could afford, and try not to argue when Pete told him he was doing something wrong. That evening, Jovan called Sarah's number. It rang 4 times, went to voicemail. Her voice, bright and professional. You've reached Sarah Pike. Please leave a message. He hung up, without speaking. What would he have said anyway? But standing in the kitchen, looking at the toy train on the windowsill, he made a decision. He found paper and pen supplies from Martha's store and began to write. Dear Sarah, he started, then stopped. Crossed it out, started again. Sarah, I'm living at Grandma and Grandpa's old house, the one we visited that summer when you were 6. I'm fixing it up. It's hard work, harder than I expected, but it feels right. I wanted you to know where I am. I wanted you to know I'm okay. I think about you every day. Love, Dad. He addressed the envelope, then wrote 2 more letters, one to Margaret, one to Daniel. Each one simple, honest, free of accusations or demands, just information. Just reaching out. He didn't mail them, not yet, but he kept them on the kitchen table, 3 white envelopes representing 3 chances he wasn't quite ready to take. Outside, snow began falling again. Inside, the house creaked and settled around him, less empty than it had been 2 weeks ago. Progress was slow, but progress was progress. 6 weeks into the restoration, the first signs of spring appeared: snowdrops pushing through melting drifts, longer days, a softness in the air that promised warmth eventually. The transformation wasn't just in the weather. The house itself had begun to breathe differently. Pete Harrigan had become a fixture, arriving every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday with his toolbox and thermos of coffee. Together they'd patched the roof, replaced broken joists, restored 3 rooms to something approaching livable. Pete worked with the quiet competence of a man who'd spent his life fixing things, and slowly, in the spaces between hammer strikes and sawing, he told his story. He'd been married once, divorced 10 years ago after his wife decided she wanted something different, someone different. Their daughter, Emily, had been 12 at the time. She'd chosen to live with her mother in Denver. Pete had visiting rights, sent money every month, called every week, but visiting rights became visits that got postponed. Calls went to voicemail more often than not. Now Emily was 22, and Pete couldn't remember the last time they'd spoken. "I was a good father," Pete said one afternoon, measuring a board for the library shelves. "At least I thought I was. But somewhere along the way, I became the inconvenient parent, the one who lived too far away, who didn't understand her world, who represented the old life she'd moved on from." Jovan held the board steady while Pete marked it. "You ever try to fix it? How do you fix someone not wanting you around?" The question hung in the sawdust-filled air. Jovan had no answer because he'd been asking himself the same thing for years. They worked in silence after that, but it was the silence of shared understanding rather than discomfort. That evening, alone in the kitchen, Jovan discovered Eleanor's recipe book. It had been wedged behind a loose board in the pantry, wrapped in waxed paper that had mostly protected it from moisture. The pages were yellowed but readable, filled with recipes in Eleanor's neat handwriting: pot roast, bread pudding, vegetable soup, Christmas cookies. But it was the margins that caught his attention. Eleanor had written notes beside almost every recipe, small comments that revealed glimpses of her life. Next to the pot roast, "Samuel's favorite always requests this on Sunday." Beside the bread pudding, "James ate 3 helpings and made himself sick, 1,939. Near the cookie recipe, "Robert's school bake sale, won 3rd place. He was so proud." And at the bottom of a recipe for apple cake, in slightly shakier handwriting, "Samuel's favorite. Made this the day before he died, June 3rd, 1967. He said it was the best I'd ever made. I'll never make it again." Jovan read that final note 3 times. The weight of it, making someone's favorite food, not knowing it would be the last time, then being unable to bear the act of making it again because the person who loved it was gone. He knew that weight. After Anna died, he'd avoided her favorite things for years. Her perfume, her music, her raspberry tea that sat untouched in the cupboard until he finally threw it away a decade later. Not because these things hurt too much, but because they hurt exactly the right amount, and he hadn't known how to let himself feel it. On impulse, Jovan checked the recipe. He had flour, sugar, butter. The town market would have apples and cinnamon. He could make this cake. He could bring Eleanor's recipe back to life in the kitchen where she'd written it. The next day was Thursday. He drove to Millbrook, bought the ingredients, stopped at Martha's for soup, as had become their routine. Over bread and broth, he told her about the recipe book. "You're going to bake?" Martha raised an eyebrow. "I used to bake with my wife. After she died, I baked with my kids. Sarah especially loved it. We'd make cookies every Sunday afternoon. She'd stand on a stool by the counter, so serious about getting the measurements exactly right." "When did you stop?" "When she didn't need a stool anymore. When she started having homework and friends and things more interesting than baking cookies with her father." He smiled, but it hurt. "I should have kept asking. Maybe she would have said yes." Martha refilled his tea. "Maybe she would have. Maybe she wouldn't have. You can't know now. All you can do is what you can do today. Back at the house, Jovan laid out the ingredients on the kitchen counter, the recipe book open beside them. Pete showed up while he was preheating the oven. The ancient beast finally worked reliably after days of tinkering. "What's all this?" Pete asked. "Apple cake. You're staying for dinner." "I don't." "You're staying." Pete grinned. "Yes, sir." They worked together, Jovan mixing and measuring, while Pete finished installing the last library shelf, the smell of cinnamon and apples gradually filling the house. When the cake came out, golden and perfect, Jovan felt something close to triumph. A small domestic victory, maybe, but it mattered. This house, empty for so long, now held warmth and food, and the kind of simple pleasure that made life worth living. Martha arrived at 6 with a casserole, claiming she'd made too much. Jovan suspected she'd made it specifically for them, but he didn't argue. The three of them ate at the kitchen table, the first proper meal in this house in decades. Over cake and coffee, Martha mentioned the town's spring festival. It's nothing fancy, just vendors in the square, music, food. But the Whitmore place used to host a garden party every year. People in town still talk about it. Eleanor's gardens were famous. Jovan looked out the window at the overgrown grounds. Somewhere, under all those dead vines and weeds, were Eleanor's gardens. Another restoration project. Another impossible task. "When's the festival?" he asked. "June 21st. Summer solstice. 3 months." Jovan did the math with Pete's help. They could have the conservatory finished by then. Maybe even start on the gardens. It was ambitious, probably foolish. But standing in his restored kitchen, sharing food with people who'd become friends, Jovan felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt capable. That night, he took out the 3 letters he'd written weeks ago. Read them again, added a few lines to each. Then he addressed fresh envelopes and included something new. A photo he'd taken on his phone of the kitchen, cleaned and bright, the toy train visible on the windowsill. Underneath he wrote, "This is what I'm building, a place to come home to, for anyone who wants to come home." He drove to town and dropped the letters in the post office mailbox before he could change his mind. 3 white envelopes disappearing into the slot, carrying words he'd held back for too long. Walking back to his car, Jovan noticed the evening sky clear and vast, stars beginning to emerge in the dusk. The same stars Samuel had written about from France, the same stars Eleanor had watched while waiting for her boys to come home, the same stars that shone over Boston and Seattle and Chicago, where his children looked up at the same sky without knowing their father was looking too. He drove back to the house, parked in the circular drive, where the fountain still sat frozen and forgotten. Tomorrow he'd start, on the conservatory. Tomorrow he'd begin clearing the gardens. Tomorrow he'd take another step toward creating something worth coming home to. But tonight he sat in the warm kitchen and ate another slice of Eleanor's apple cake, perfect and sweet, a recipe brought back from silence. Outside, the first spring peepers began their chorus in the distant pond. Inside, the house settled around him with creaks that sounded less like protest and more like welcome. 8 weeks in, and the gardens revealed themselves slowly. What Jovan had taken for dead brambles turned out to be rose bushes, dormant but alive. Beneath layers of rotted leaves, stone pathways emerged like the bones of some ancient creature. And in the center of what had once been the main garden, half buried in soil and vines, he found a bronze bell. It took Pete and him an hour to dig it free. The bell was heavy, about the size of a dinner plate, with a clapper that still moved when shaken. Someone had inscribed words around the rim. Jovan cleaned away decades of tarnish with metal polish until he could read them. "All who wander are not lost, ring to find your way home. Garden dinner bell," Pete said, examining it. "Used to call folks in from the grounds. My grandmother had one. Said in the old days, estates like this would ring it at sunset, let everyone know it was time to come back to the house." Jovan turned the bell in his hands, feeling its weight, its purpose. A way to call people home. He thought about his letters, sent 2 weeks ago. met with silence. No responses, no calls, no acknowledgement they'd been received. Maybe they'd been thrown away unread. Maybe his children had looked at his words and felt nothing. Maybe the distance between them was too great for letters to bridge. But he had this bell now, and he had a house that was becoming something worth returning to. They hung it on the front porch that afternoon, suspending it from an iron bracket Pete fashioned from scrap metal. When it was secure, Joven pulled the rope. The sound rang out across the valley, clear and strong, echoing off the stone walls of the house, carrying through the greening woods and across the pond where ice had finally melted. It was the first time that bell had rung in probably 50 years. The first time this house had called out to the world in decades. Martha heard it from town, 5 miles away. She told Joven later that she'd been in her kitchen and stopped what she was doing, went to the window, listened. "Thought I was imagining things," she said. "Then I realized someone brought that old bell back to life." Word spread through Millbrook, the way news spreads in small towns, quickly and with embellishment. The old man at the Whitmore place had restored the dinner bell. He was fixing up the whole estate, working on the gardens. Some folks remembered Eleanor's garden parties, the way the grounds used to look in summer roses and lavender and paths lined with lanterns. On Saturday afternoon, a young couple appeared at the end of the drive. Joven was working in the garden, pulling weeds, when he noticed them mid-30s, holding hands, hesitating by the old stone pillars. "Can I help you?" he called. They approached slowly. The man spoke first. "Sorry to bother you. We're Tom and Lisa Brennan. We moved to Millbrook 3 months ago. We heard about what you're doing here and, well, we wondered if you might need help." Joven straightened, his back protesting. "Help? We're new in town," Lisa said. "Don't know many people yet. Tom does landscaping for a living, and I used to work in historic restoration before we moved. We thought maybe we could volunteer a few hours on weekends, if you're interested." Something in Joven's chest loosened slightly. "Why would you want to do that?" Tom shrugged. "Honestly? Because this place is beautiful, even half-ruined, and because starting over in a new town is lonely. We figured working on something meaningful might help us feel less like outsiders." Joven understood that feeling better than they knew. "All right then, if you're serious, I could use the help." They were serious. Tom assessed the gardens with a professional eye, pointing out what could be saved and what needed replacing. Lisa walked through the conservatory, taking notes, explaining which original features were worth preserving and which modern updates would help. They worked all afternoon, refusing payment, accepting only Martha's soup and the apple cake Joven had learned to make perfectly. As the sun set, they stood together on the porch, looking at what they'd accomplished. Tom had cleared 2 whole flower beds. Lisa had sketched plans for the conservatory restoration, and Joven had spent the day working alongside people who chose to be there, who wanted to help. Before they left, Tom said, "We'll come back next Saturday. If that's okay." "It's more than okay." The following Tuesday, Pete arrived with unexpected news. "Got a call last night," he said, setting down his toolbox. "From my daughter." Joven looked up from the floorboard he was prying loose. "Emily said she got a letter from Martha." Pete's voice was carefully neutral. "Martha wrote to her, told her about this place, about us working together. Told her I talk about her all the time." "Do you?" "Yeah, I do." Pete sat heavily on a sawbuck. "Emily said she'd like to visit next month, just for a weekend. But," his voice cracked, "it's more than I've gotten in 2 years." Joven set down his tools and walked over, put a hand on Pete's shoulder. They stood like that for a moment, 2 fathers who'd lost their children to distance and time, one of them with a chance at getting something back. "You think Martha was meddling?" Pete asked finally. "I think Martha was helping." "Should I be mad? Are you?" Pete thought about it. "No, I'm grateful. And terrified. What if Emily comes and realizes she was right to stay away? What if I disappoint her again? What if you don't?" The question hung between them. Pete nodded slowly, stood, picked up his hammer. Guess I better make sure this house is perfect when she gets here. Can't have her thinking her old man doesn't know his way around a restoration project. They worked with renewed energy after that. Pete throwing himself into the conservatory repairs with something approaching joy. He talked more than usual, telling stories about Emily as a little girl, the fort they'd built in the backyard, the time she'd tried to fix his truck with duct tape and determination. Jovan listened and felt the strange mix of happiness for his friend and ache for himself. Pete's daughter was coming. His own children remained silent as stones. That evening Jovan rang the bell again. Just because he could. Just because it felt good to send sound out into the world, a call that said, "Here is a place worth coming to. Here is welcome. Here is home." He didn't know if anyone would answer that call, but he rang it anyway. Inside, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote in a journal he'd started keeping, not for anyone else, just for himself. A record of the work, the days, the slow accumulation of repair and restoration. He wrote about the bell, about Tom and Lisa, about Pete's daughter calling. He wrote about his own children and the silence that stretched between them. And then he wrote, "I'm building something here. Maybe they'll come, maybe they won't. But I'm building it anyway. For the first time in years, I'm building instead of watching things fall apart. That has to count for something." He closed the journal and looked at the toy train on the windowsill, at the recipe book on the shelf, at the kitchen transformed from ruin to warmth. Evidence of work done, progress made, life returning to empty spaces. The bell swayed slightly in the evening breeze, visible through the window, ready to ring again whenever someone needed to find their way home. 10 weeks into the restoration, Jovan remembered the mailbox. It stood at the end of the long drive by the stone pillars, rusted and listing to one side, half hidden by overgrown weeds. He'd driven past it 100 times, never once thinking to check it. Why would he? No one knew his address. No one was writing to him. But on a morning when spring had fully arrived, trees budding green, warm sunlight replacing winter's grey, he decided to walk down the drive instead of driving to town. Exercise, fresh air, a chance to see how the grounds looked from the road. He'd been so focused on the house itself that he'd neglected to consider the approach, the first impression visitors would have. The mailbox door stuck when he tried to open it. He had to work it back and forth, flakes of rust falling away before it finally gave. Inside was a pile of junk mail catalogues for the previous owner, credit card offers addressed to current resident, advertising circulars yellowed with age, and beneath all of it, a single white envelope. His hands were shaking as he pulled it free. The return address was Chicago, Sarah's handwriting. The postmark was 3 months old, sent to his old address, forwarded here, arriving sometime in February when he'd been too focused on survival to check a mailbox buried in snow. Jovan stood at the end of the drive, spring breeze moving through the new leaves, and opened his daughter's letter. "Dear Dad," it began, "I've been trying to reach you. Your phone goes straight to voicemail, and when I called your old number, it said disconnected. Margaret told me you sold the house. No one knows where you went. I need to talk to you. My marriage is falling apart. Richard and I have been in counseling for 6 months, but I don't know if it's working. I feel so alone, and I wanted to hear your voice. I wanted you to tell me what to do, or at least tell me it's going to be okay. I'm not angry that you haven't called back. I'm just worried. Please, if you get this, call me. I love you, Sarah." The letter slipped from his fingers, caught by the breeze, skittered across the gravel. Jovan retrieved it, read it again, then a third time. 3 months. She'd written this 3 months ago. She'd been trying to reach him, needed him, and he'd been here rebuilding a house while his daughter's life was falling apart. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands. The phone he'd bought to replace his old one, the one he'd set up hastily before leaving, never bothering to properly transfer his number or update his voicemail or make sure it was working correctly. He'd been so focused on his own isolation that he'd accidentally made himself unreachable. He called Sarah. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. Her voice the same as always. "You've reached Sarah Pike. Please leave a message." "Sarah, it's Dad. I just got your letter. I'm so sorry." His voice broke. "Please call me back." He tried Margaret next. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice clipped and professional. "This is Margaret Pike." "Margaret, it's your father." A pause. "Dad, what number is this?" "I got a new phone." "I'm sorry I didn't." "Do you have any idea how worried we've been?" Her voice was cold, the tone she used in courtrooms. "You sold the house, disconnected your phone, and disappeared. Daniel thought you might be dead. Sarah's been calling hospitals. I didn't mean to worry anyone. I moved to..." "Where? Where did you move to that required cutting off all contact with your family?" "I'm at Grandpa's old house, the estate. I'm fixing it up." Another pause. Longer this time. "The house in the middle of nowhere that's been abandoned for decades? That house?" "Yes." "Why would you?" She stopped, took a breath. He could hear her composure cracking. "We thought you didn't want to hear from us. When your phone stopped working and you didn't leave a new number, we thought you were done with us." The words hit like physical blows. "What? No, I would never." "Then, why didn't you tell us where you were going? Why didn't you make sure we could reach you?" Jovan sank down onto the gravel, his back against the mailbox post. "Because I thought you were done with me. The calls had stopped. The visits stopped. I thought I was becoming a burden, someone you had to check on out of obligation. I thought if I disappeared quietly, it would be easier for everyone." "Easier?" Margaret's voice rose. "You thought it would be easier to let us think we'd lost you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I got Sarah's letter today. It was sent months ago, but I didn't check the mailbox. I didn't think anyone would write. Of course we would write. Of course we would call. You're our father." Her voice cracked now, the professional veneer gone. "You don't get to just leave without saying goodbye. You don't get to decide we're better off without you. Can I talk to Sarah?" Her letter said, "Her marriage is a mess. She's been drowning, and the one person she wanted to talk to had vanished." Margaret paused. "I'll tell her you called. But Dad, you need to fix this. You need to actually try this time, not just disappear when things get hard." "I will, I promise." "Good." She hung up. Jovan sat in the gravel for a long time, phone in his hand, letter clutched in the other. He'd thought he was the abandoned one, thought he was the father left behind by children too busy for him. But from their perspective, he'd disappeared without warning. He'd cut off contact, sold the family home, and vanished into the countryside. They'd tried to call. His phone hadn't worked properly. They'd tried to write. He hadn't checked the mailbox. The silence he'd interpreted as rejection had been confusion and worry on their end. He'd been so wrapped up in his own loneliness that he'd created more of it. Daniel called an hour later. "Dad? Daniel, I'm so sorry. Where the hell are you?" His son's voice was tight with anger and relief. "Do you know what it's like to call your father's phone and get nothing? To drive by his house and see it sold? We thought you were dead, or sick, or I'm at Grandpa's estate, I'm fixing it up. I should have told you. I should have made sure my phone worked. I thought..." He stopped. "I thought you didn't want to hear from me." "Why would you think that?" "Because the calls stopped. Because years went by and no one visited. Because we're all busy and stupid and took you for granted," Daniel said. "Because I was ashamed to call after my divorce and tell you I'd failed at marriage. Because it was easier to stay away than face you and admit my life wasn't perfect. But that doesn't mean I stopped loving you. That doesn't mean I wanted you gone." The words broke something in Jovan's chest. "I didn't know." "Well, now you do. And you're going to stay where you are. And you're going to keep your phone on. And you're going to answer when we call. Understood?" "Understood. Good. I have to go. But Dad, I'm glad you're alive, even if you're an idiot." That evening, Pete found Jovan sitting on the front porch, staring at nothing. He sat down beside him without speaking, waited. I mailed letters to my kids, Joven said finally, told them where I was, what I was doing, invited them to visit. But they'd already been trying to reach me for months. I just didn't know because my phone was broken and I didn't check the mailbox. The whole time I thought they'd abandoned me, they thought I'd abandoned them. Pete was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? I don't know. They're angry. They have a right to be. I disappeared without warning. From their perspective, I ran away. Did you? Joven thought about it. Maybe I was running from being a burden, from getting old and needy, from asking for help. You're asking for help now, here, with this house. That's different. Is it? Martha arrived with dinner, as she often did now. She took one look at Joven's face and set down her casserole dish. What happened? He told them both about the letter, the calls, the misunderstanding that had grown like mold in the dark space between him and his children. When he finished, Martha nodded slowly. So you made a mistake, several mistakes. You're 81, not dead. You can fix mistakes. I don't know how. The same way you've been fixing this house, she said. One piece at a time. You can't undo the past 3 months. You can only build from where you are now. That night, Joven wrote new letters to each of his children. Different letters this time. Honest about his mistakes, his fears, his realization that he'd been wrong about so many things. He apologized for disappearing. He explained about the house, the work, the slow rebuilding of something that had been abandoned. And at the end of each letter he wrote, I'm hosting a garden party here on June 21st. Summer solstice. I would like you to come. I'll understand if you can't or won't, but the invitation is real. And the door is open. All who wander are not lost. Come find your way home. He mailed the letters the next morning. 3 white envelopes carrying words that mattered, sent to children who might or might not respond. It was all he could do. The rest was up to them. 12 weeks into the restoration, May arrived with warmth and purpose. Joven worked with renewed urgency now, not frantic but focused. June 21st was 6 weeks away. The garden party would happen whether his children came or not, because the work itself had become important beyond his original intentions. The conservatory had become his obsession. Pete shared that obsession, understanding without words that this room half destroyed, beautiful even in ruin, represented something larger than glass and iron. They worked together, stripping old frames, measuring for new panes, reinforcing the structure so it wouldn't collapse under the weight of another winter. Tom spent his Saturdays clearing the gardens, following what he could find of Eleanor's original design. He discovered rose bushes that had survived decades of neglect, their roots deep and stubborn. He found stone benches buried under ivy. He unearthed a sundial with the inscription mostly worn away, only the words time and garden still legible. Lisa researched historical records at the library, finding photographs of the estate from the 1952. She brought them to Joven one Thursday evening, spreading them across the kitchen table. There was Eleanor's garden in full bloom, roses and lavender, pathways lined with boxwood, the conservatory glowing in summer twilight. This is what it looked like, Lisa said, her finger tracing the layout. We can recreate this. Not exactly, but close enough. Joven studied the photographs, seeing his grandmother as a young woman standing among the flowers, Samuel beside her in a white shirt and suspenders. In another photo, 2 boys ran through the gardens, their faces blurred by motion and time. James and Robert, caught in a moment of joy before war and loss, changed everything. Let's do it, he said. Word spread through Millbrook that the Whitmore place was planning a garden party. The news moved through the hardware store, the diner, the post office, gathering momentum and volunteers. People Joven had never met stopped by offering help. An elderly woman brought seedlings from her own garden, the same varieties Eleanor had grown, saved through generations. A retired contractor looked at the conservatory and suggested structural improvements. A high school music teacher asked if the party would need musicians, the house filled with activity and life. On any given day, half a dozen people might be working on different projects. Martha organizing supplies, Pete installing windows, Tom planting flowers, Lisa directing the overall restoration with an architect's eye for detail. It was exhausting. It was glorious. 2 weeks before the party, Jovan was working in the attic, sorting through boxes left by previous owners when he found a photograph in an old frame. The glass was cracked, but the photo intact, a family standing on the front steps of the house. Summer, probably 1985, judging by the clothes. A younger Jovan, still dark-haired, Anna beside him, radiant in a sundress. And 3 children, Margaret, serious even at 13, Daniel grinning at 10, Sarah at 7 holding a stuffed rabbit. Jovan didn't remember this photo being taken, couldn't remember that visit at all, though clearly they'd come here, stood on these steps, smiled for the camera. His father must have taken the photo, must have packed it away after that summer. How many other moments had he forgotten? How many visits and conversations and small joys had slipped through the gaps in memory? He carried the photo downstairs, cleaned the glass carefully, and placed it in the conservatory, where light from the new windows illuminated it. His family, frozen in time, preserved in this house that was supposed to be just a summer retreat, but had instead witnessed so many crucial moments. That evening, he wrote in his journal, "Found a photo today. We came here once, all of us together. I don't remember it, but the photo doesn't lie. We were happy. We were whole. I want to believe we can be again, even if differently, even if we can never go back to that summer day on the steps." He added the photo to the new letters he was writing, longer letters this time, including details about the restoration, about Pete and Martha and Tom and Lisa, about the community that had formed around this project. He wrote about Eleanor's recipes and James's toy train and the dinner bell that rang each evening at sunset. "I'm not asking you to fix the past," he wrote to each child. "I'm inviting you to see the present, to see what I've built from ruins, to see that even broken things can be made beautiful again." He mailed the letters, along with copies of the photograph. 3 envelopes, carrying memories and hope in equal measure. Pete's daughter, Emily, arrived on a Saturday in late May. Jovan watched from the conservatory as Pete's truck pulled up, as a young woman got out, as father and daughter stood looking at each other across 3 feet of gravel and 2 years of silence. Then Emily stepped forward and hugged her father, and Pete's shoulders shook with sobs he'd been holding back for too long. They spent the day at the house, Emily marveling at the restoration, Pete showing her everything he'd built and fixed with barely contained pride. At dinner, Martha had brought enough food for 10 people. Emily told stories about college and her job and her life, and Pete listened with the intensity of a man memorizing every word. "I should have called sooner," Emily said. "I kept meaning to, but time kept passing, and it got harder." "I know that feeling," Jovan said quietly. After dinner, Pete and Emily walked the gardens together, talking in low voices Jovan couldn't hear. When they came back, Pete's eyes were red, but his smile was genuine. "She's staying through the party," he told Jovan later. "She wants to help," she said. His voice caught. "She said she's proud of me, of this work, of what we've built." Jovan gripped his friend's shoulder. "Good. That's good." The final 2 weeks blurred together in a rush of work. The conservatory came together piece by piece, new glass installed, framework painted, the floor restored to gleaming tile. Tom transformed the gardens from wilderness to something approaching beauty, planting hundreds of flowers, trimming hedges, restoring pathways. Lisa coordinated everything with the efficiency of a general directing troops. Martha organized the food, recruiting other women from town who remembered Eleanor's garden parties and wanted to recreate the magic. They planned a menu from Eleanor's recipe book, her pot roast, her famous apple cake, her lemonade made with honey instead of sugar. Tables were borrowed from the church. Chairs appeared from various attics and basements around town. Someone donated tablecloths. Someone else provided lanterns to line the pathways. The entire community had invested in this party, in this restoration, in the idea that beautiful things shouldn't be allowed to die. 3 days before the party, Jovan received a phone call. Margaret. Dad, I got your letters. All of them. His heart hammered. And Sarah and I have been talking. Daniel too. We're trying to decide if we can make it. I understand if you can't. It's a long trip. And we should have come sooner. That's what Sarah keeps saying. We should have visited years ago, before things got so broken. Things aren't broken beyond repair, Jovan said. I've learned that these past few months, even houses left empty for decades can be brought back to life. Margaret was quiet for a moment. I'll let you know. About the party. She hung up before he could respond. That night, Jovan couldn't sleep. He walked through the house room by room, seeing it not as it had been 12 weeks ago, but as it was now. The kitchen warm and functional, the entry hall gleaming, the library shelves filled with books salvaged from the wreckage, the bedrooms upstairs cleaned and ready, beds made with fresh linens just in case, and the conservatory the crown jewel of the restoration. Glass walls reflecting moonlight, plants in new pots waiting to be placed, the photograph of his family on a small table by the door. A room that had been completely destroyed, now made beautiful again. He thought about Eleanor and Samuel, about the life they'd built here and the losses they'd endured. He thought about James, who never came home, and Robert, who couldn't bear to return. He thought about his own children scattered across the country, each carrying their own wounds, their own reasons for staying away. The dinner bell hung silent on the porch. In 3 days, he would ring it to start the party. In 3 days, he would know if his children valued the invitation enough to come. In 3 days, he would learn if the past 3 months of work had been for himself alone or for something larger. But standing in the conservatory under moonlight, surrounded by evidence of transformation and renewal, Jovan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, hope was too fragile, too desperate. This was something steadier. Acceptance, maybe. Understanding that he'd done what he could do, built what he could build, offered what he could offer. The rest wasn't up to him. He placed 3 stones in his pocket, one for Margaret, one for Daniel, one for Sarah. An old superstition Anna had taught him long ago. Carry a stone for someone you love, and they'll find their way home. It was probably nonsense, but he carried them anyway. Outside, the gardens waited for celebration. Inside, the house waited to be filled with voices and laughter and life. And Jovan waited, patient now in a way he hadn't been before, for whatever June 21st would bring. June 21st arrived with golden morning light and cloudless sky. Jovan woke at dawn, lay in the upstairs bedroom for a moment listening to birdsong through the open window. 3 months ago he'd slept on the kitchen floor in a sleeping bag, surrounded by ruin. Now he woke in a proper bed, in a proper room, surrounded by restoration and possibility. He dressed carefully in clothes Martha had insisted he buy for the occasion: a crisp white shirt, dark slacks, a light jacket. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw an old man, thinner than he'd been in February, sun-weathered from outdoor work, but standing straighter, looking more alive. Downstairs the house gleamed, every surface cleaned, every room ready. He walked through slowly, running his hand along the banister Pete had refinished, pausing in the library where books now lined the shelves, stopping in the conservatory where morning light turned the glass. Walls into cathedral windows. On the small table by the conservatory door sat the family photograph from 1985. Beside it he placed Eleanor's letters, the toy train, and the recipe book. Small artifacts of lives lived in this house, connections across time. The stones were still in his pocket, one for each child. He touched them like a talisman. By 9 o'clock, people started arriving to help set up. Martha directed operations from the kitchen, marshalling volunteers like a beloved commander. Pete and Emily worked together, stringing lanterns along the garden paths. Tom made final adjustments to the flower beds, ensuring everything was perfect. Lisa arranged tables and chairs with an artist's eye for composition. Jovan found himself mostly watching, overcome by the sight of so many people working together to create something beautiful. His project had become their project. His restoration had become a community celebration. At noon, Martha found him standing alone by the fountain now. Cleaned and running, water cascading over stones that had been dry for decades. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I don't know what I'm feeling. That's allowed. What if they don't come?" Martha squeezed his arm. "Then you still have this house, these gardens, these people who showed up. That's not nothing." He nodded, not trusting his voice. By 2 o'clock, everything was ready. Tables set with white tablecloths including Eleanor's pristine linen with Whitmore 1942 embroidered on the border, food arranged on serving platters, flowers in vases, musicians tuning instruments in the shade of an old oak tree. The gardens transformed into something Eleanor herself might have recognized, not exactly as they were, but close enough to honor her vision. Townspeople began gathering, elderly couples who remembered the original parties, young families curious about the restored estate, everyone dressed in summer clothes and bringing covered dishes despite Martha's insistence. That food was handled. Pete found Jovan at 2:30. "Emily wants to know where you want the gift table." "Gift table?" People brought things. "Housewarming presents, they're calling them." Jovan's throat tightened. "I didn't expect, I know, but that's what community does. They show up." At 2:45, Jovan checked his phone for the 100th time. No messages, no calls. His children weren't coming. He'd known it was possible, even likely. Distance and hurt weren't erased by letters and invitations, but knowing didn't make the disappointment easier. At 3 o'clock, he stood on the front porch, the dinner bell's rope in his hand. Nearly 50 people filled the gardens below, talking, laughing, admiring the restored grounds. Pete stood with his arm around Emily. Martha chatted with the musicians. Tom and Lisa held hands by the roses they'd planted together. It was beautiful. It was enough. It had to be enough. Jovan pulled the rope. The bell rang out across the valley, clear and strong, calling everyone home. The conversations quieted. People turned toward the house, smiling, waiting for him to speak. He'd prepared words, but they dissolved in his throat. Instead, he said simply, "Thank you for helping me bring this place back to life, for showing me that broken things can be made whole, for being here." Applause rippled through the crowd. The musicians began to play something soft and sweet that drifted through the gardens like memory made audible. Jovan descended the steps, accepting handshakes and embraces, trying to focus on the joy around him instead of the empty spaces where his children should have been. He was grateful. He was heartbroken. He was both at once. At 3:30, he stood by the fountain talking with an elderly woman who remembered Eleanor's roses, only half listening to her stories, when he heard a car engine on the drive. His heart stopped. A sedan appeared between the stone pillars, moving slowly up the gravel road. Then, another car behind it. Then a third. The woman beside him kept talking, but Jovan couldn't hear her anymore. Couldn't hear anything over the rushing in his ears. The first car stopped at the bottom of the steps. The door opened. Sarah stepped out. She looked older than he remembered, tired around the eyes, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a small overnight bag. She stood by the car, looking up at the house, and her hand went to her mouth. Then the second car's door opened, and Margaret emerged elegant in a tailored pantsuit, her expression carefully controlled but her eyes already wet. The third car's door opened, and Daniel got out. He reached back and lifted a small boy from a car seat, maybe 3 years old, with Daniel's dark hair and curious eyes. Jovan's children stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at him, and he stood frozen on the garden path, one hand touching the stones in his pocket, unable to move or speak or breathe. Sarah moved first. She set down her bag and walked up the steps, slow at first, then faster. Her face crumpled as she reached him. "Dad," she said, and then she was in his arms, crying against his shoulder. Joven held her, felt her shake with sobs, stroked her hair the way he used to when she was small and woke from nightmares. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm right here." Margaret came next, her composure finally breaking. She joined the embrace, her arms around both of them, her voice thick with tears. "We should have come sooner. I'm so sorry, we should have come sooner." Daniel approached, carrying the little boy, who watched the scene with wide, uncertain eyes. When the embrace opened to include them, Daniel's voice was rough. "Dad, this is James, your grandson. He wanted to meet his grandpa." Joven looked at the child, 3 years old, Daniel had said on the phone months ago, but Joven had never met him, never even seen a photograph. His grandson, named James, like Eleanor's lost son, like the toy train on the windowsill. "Hello, James," Joven managed. The boy studied him seriously. "You're really old." "Despite everything," Joven laughed, "I really am. Can I see your house?" "Yes, yes, of course you can." They stood there on the steps, the 5 of them together for the first time in years, while the party continued around them in respectful distance. Pete caught Joven's eye from across the garden and nodded once, a gesture of understanding from one father to another. Finally, they separated, wiping eyes, trying to compose themselves. Sarah kept one hand on Joven's arm as if afraid he might disappear again. "We got your letters," Margaret said. "All of them. The first ones and the last ones and the ones with the photograph. I should have sent them sooner. Should have told you where I was going. We should have called more," Daniel said. "Should have visited. Should have made sure you knew you mattered." Should have," Sarah said, her voice breaking again. "We both messed up, Dad. Can we just agree we both messed up and move forward?" Joven pulled the 3 stones from his pocket. They sat in his palm, smooth and ordinary, just rocks from the garden path. "Your mother taught me this. You carry a stone for someone you love, and they'll find their way home." Sarah took 1 stone, then Margaret, then Daniel. They stood holding these small pieces of the estate, these fragments of the place their father had rebuilt. "Show us," Margaret said, "show us what you've done." He walked them through the house, room by room, telling the story of the restoration, the kitchen where he'd camped that first night, the study where he'd found Eleanor's letters, the library Pete had helped rebuild, the bedrooms upstairs, including the one he'd prepared for each of them, just in case. In the conservatory, they stood looking at the photograph from 1985. "I don't remember this," Daniel said. "Neither did I. But it happened. We were here, together." Sarah picked up the toy train. "What's this?" "It belonged to a boy named James Whitmore. He died in the war. His mother kept this house for years after he was gone, but she couldn't stay. Too many memories." "Like our house," Sarah said quietly. "After Mom died. Too many memories." "Yes, but I learned something here. Memories don't have to be painful. They can be gifts, connections across time." Little James tugged on his father's hand. "Can we go see the party?" They walked outside together, and Joven introduced his children to the community that had helped him. Martha hugged each of them fiercely. Pete shook their hands, Emily beside him smiling. Tom and Lisa welcomed them with the warmth of people who understood what family reunions meant. The party resumed, but different now, not just a celebration of a restored house, but of a restored family. The musicians played, and children danced on the lawn. Food was shared, stories told, laughter rising into the evening air. As the sun began to set, painting the sky gold and pink, Joven stood with his 3 children in the garden. Little James was asleep in Daniel's arms, exhausted from running through paths and chasing butterflies. "I'm not asking for everything to be perfect," Joven said. "I know we have work to do. I know there's still hurt and distance to overcome. But I'm asking for this, for chances, for trying, for not giving up on each other. Margaret took his hand. We're here, Dad. We came. You came, he echoed. Sarah leaned against his shoulder. Can we stay the week? I don't have to be back until next Monday. There are beds ready. There's always been beds ready. Daniel shifted James in his arms. Then we'll stay. The dinner bells swayed gently in the evening breeze. Around them, lanterns began to glow as darkness approached. Music drifted through the gardens Eleanor had planted so long ago. And Jovan Pike, 81 years old, stood surrounded by his children in a house he'd brought back from ruin and felt something he'd thought was lost forever. He felt home. Evening settled over the estate like a blessing. The party gradually wound down guests, departing with hugs and promises to visit again, musicians packing instruments, tables being cleared by volunteers who refused to let Jovan help. Martha kissed his cheek before leaving. Pete and Emily waved from Pete's truck, father and daughter heading home together. In the conservatory, Jovan sat with his children as twilight deepened into night. Little James slept on a cushioned bench covered with Daniel's jacket. Lantern light flickered through the glass walls, casting soft shadows. They talked, really talked, for the first time in years. Sarah told him about her marriage, about the counselling that was slowly helping, about the fear that she'd end up alone, like he'd been. Margaret admitted she'd thrown herself into work to avoid dealing with loneliness, that her corner office felt emptier than she'd ever acknowledged. Daniel confessed that after his divorce he'd been ashamed to call, afraid of disappointing the father who'd raised 3 children alone without complaining. I complained, Jovan said. Just not where you could hear me. Were we difficult? Sarah asked. You were human. You were children who'd lost your mother. I was a father who'd lost his wife. We did the best we could. Was it enough? Margaret's voice was small, younger than her 43 years. Jovan thought about that. It got us here. To this moment, to you sitting in this room, I rebuilt from ruins. Maybe that's enough. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that holds peace rather than tension. Through the windows, the gardens glowed with lingering lantern light. I was angry when you disappeared, Margaret said finally. Angry that you didn't trust us enough to tell us you were struggling. I didn't want to be a burden. You're our father. You're allowed to need things. I'm learning that, Jovan said. This house taught me. I couldn't restore it alone. I needed Pete and Martha and Tom and Lisa and dozens of people from town. I had to learn to ask for help, to accept it when offered. Daniel shifted, careful not to wake James. We need to talk about practical things, about making sure you're okay out here, about staying in touch properly. I fixed my phone, Jovan said with a slight smile, and I checked the mailbox now. We'll visit, Sarah said, regularly. Not just promises, actual visits. Once a month, we'll rotate. One of us will come. You don't have to. We want to, Margaret interrupted. We should have wanted to before. We were selfish and blind, and we're not going to be that way anymore. Little James stirred, opened his eyes, looked around confused. Daniel lifted him. Hey, buddy, you fell asleep. The boy rubbed his eyes. Is it time to go home? Not yet, Daniel said. We're staying here for a while. At Grandpa's house. At Grandpa's house. James looked at Jovan with sudden excitement. Can I play with the toy train? The one on the windowsill in the kitchen? That belonged to another boy named James, a long time ago. Like me? Like you. And yes, you can play with it. Carefully. They walked through the house together, Jovan showing James the train, watching his grandsons wonder at something so simple. Margaret and Sarah prepared tea in the kitchen, Eleanor's recipe for chamomile with honey. Daniel stood by the window, looking out at the darkened gardens. This place, he said quietly. It's beautiful, Dad, what you've done here. It's not finished. The gardens need another year of work. The 3rd floor still needs repairs. But it's livable. It's home. Later, after James had been put to bed in one of the upstairs rooms and Margaret and Sarah had retired to their own rooms, Jovan and Daniel sat on the front porch. The dinner bell hung silent above them, silver in the moonlight. "I named him James," Daniel said, "after your grandfather. I should have told you when he was born, should have invited you to meet him. You're here now. He's here now. Will that be enough? For you?" Jovan thought about Eleanor's letters, about James Whitmore who never came home, about Robert who couldn't bear to return, about all the ways families break and sometimes, rarely, find their way back together. "Yes," he said, "it's enough." The next morning Jovan woke to the sound of his grandson's laughter echoing through the house. He lay in bed for a moment, listening to footsteps on the stairs, voices in the kitchen, the ordinary sounds of family living in spaces he'd restored. He rose and dressed, touched the brass pocket watch on his nightstand. Still frozen at 3:47, but he'd stopped needing it to tell time. Time was moving forward, with or without working watches. Downstairs, Sarah was making breakfast using Eleanor's recipes. Margaret sat at the table with her laptop, trying to work, but smiling at James as he zoomed. The toy train. Across the floor, Daniel poured coffee, passed Jovan a cup without asking. "Morning, Dad," they said in various iterations. "Morning," he replied, and sat down at the table in his restored kitchen, surrounded by his children, and felt the weight of 3 months of work settle into something like peace. Through the window, he could see the gardens needing attention, the fountain running clear, the conservatory gleaming in morning light. So much work ahead still. But work shared was easier than work done alone. That evening, as his children prepared dinner together, laughing, arguing about whose turn it was to chop onions, pulling recipes from Eleanor's book, Jovan walked outside and rang the dinner bell. Its sound carried across the valley, over the gardens and pond, through the woods and toward town. A call to come home, a promise that home was worth coming to. Inside, his family waited. Outside, the estate stood solid and beautiful, testament to what could be built from ruins. And Jovan Pike, 81 years old, walked back through the door he'd restored with his own hands into a house full of voices and life, and understood finally that some broken things could be made whole again, not perfect, not unchanged, but whole enough to matter, whole enough to call home.